Ramree Island, a remote yet vital stretch of land off the coast of Burma, now Myanmar, became a key battleground in early 1945. The island wasn't just another jungle-covered landmass. It was a critical stronghold in the Pacific theater of World War II. For the Japanese forces, it was a defensive linchpin. For the British, it was the key to breaking Japan's control over Burma's coastline and securing Allied dominance in the region. Spanning over 520 square miles, Ramree was covered in dense mangrove forests, tidal rivers, and mosquito-infested swamps. But its true value lay in its location. Positioned at the mouth of the Bay of Bengal, it was a natural gateway for naval movement and supply lines. If the British captured Ramree, they could use it as a launching point for future attacks, cutting off the Japanese supply chain and hastening their retreat from Burma. The island also hosted an airstrip, a crucial asset for both reconnaissance and bombardment missions. By early January 1945, the British 26th Indian Division, under Operation Matador, launched a well-coordinated amphibious assault backed by warships, bombers, and artillery fire. The Japanese, numbering around 1,000 to 1,200 troops, had dug in, preparing to resist any landings with entrenched machine gun nests, sniper positions, and booby traps. They were vastly outgunned, but determined to hold their ground, knowing that surrender was not an option under Imperial Japanese military doctrine. The British forces, better equipped and supported by naval firepower, managed to push the Japanese back from their coastal defenses within days. Fierce fighting ensued in the jungles and villages, with British commandos flushing out Japanese defenders from bunkers and hidden sniper nests. Grenades, flamethrowers, and relentless artillery barrages forced the Japanese into disarray. By mid-January, the British had established control over most of the island. However, one group of Japanese soldiers refused to surrender. Facing certain defeat, they made a desperate decision. Instead of retreating toward British-controlled zones, they chose to escape into the heart of Ramree's mangrove swamps. Their plan was to regroup with other Japanese forces on the mainland by trekking through miles of uncharted, hostile terrain. It was a fatal mistake. The British sealed off all escape routes, forcing these Japanese soldiers into an environment unlike anything they had encountered before. The thick swamp was a nightmare of waist-deep mud, oppressive heat, venomous insects, and an unseen danger lurking beneath the surface. Saltwater crocodiles, some of the largest and most aggressive in the world. Trapped in the murky, tangled jungle, the Japanese soldiers had no idea what awaited them. Supplies ran low, exhaustion set in, and disease began to spread. But these hardships were nothing compared to the horror that would come next. As night fell, the jungle remained eerily silent until the first screams began. As the British tightened their grip on Ramree Island, the remaining 1,000 to 1,200 Japanese soldiers found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation. Cut off from reinforcements, low on supplies, and with no hope of naval evacuation, they were left with one agonizing decision: to flee into the mangrove swamps. This retreat was not part of any structured military plan. It was a desperate gamble, made under immense pressure, as British artillery and infantry advanced relentlessly. Japanese commanders, unwilling to surrender, ordered their troops into the dense, uncharted wetlands, hoping to escape encirclement and regroup with other Japanese forces inland. But this was a fatal miscalculation. 1. Underestimating the terrain. Unlike the solid ground of Ramree's villages and coastal defenses, the swamp was a nightmarish labyrinth of thick mud, tangled roots, and brackish water. Soldiers waded through waist-deep, stagnant pools that reeked of decay. Movement was painfully slow, and the jungle's dense canopy blocked sunlight, making it nearly impossible to navigate. Each step forward was a struggle, draining energy and morale. What the Japanese did not realize was that Ramree's swamp was not just a jungle, it was a death trap. The land was so soft that some soldiers reportedly sank into quicksand like mud, unable to free themselves. Thick vines and mangrove roots formed impenetrable walls, and some soldiers, disoriented in the darkness, wandered in circles. 2. Lack of food and clean water. The retreating troops had no time to carry adequate supplies. What little rations they had were quickly consumed, and the swamp's water was undrinkable, teeming with parasites and bacteria. Dysentery, dehydration, and malnutrition set in almost immediately, weakening the soldiers before they even faced the island's deadliest predators. Many were forced to drink the putrid swamp water to survive, only to succumb to violent sickness. Weakened by disease and hunger, they became easy prey. 3. British tactical superiority. The British, aware of the Japanese retreat, did not pursue them into the swamp. Instead, they used a far more effective strategy. Artillery fire and air reconnaissance ensured the Japanese could not emerge without facing immediate attack. British patrols sealed off exit routes, ensuring that any attempt to flee the swamp would result in immediate capture or death. Psychological warfare played a role as well. Knowing the dangers of the swamp, British forces broadcast messages urging the Japanese to surrender, warning them of the horrors they would face. But the Japanese had been trained to fight to the death. They ignored the warnings and pressed deeper into the dark, unforgiving waters of the mangrove swamps. For the psychological toll of the jungle, soldiers who entered the swamp soon realized their mistake. In the darkness, the constant buzz of insects, the croaking of unseen creatures, and the oppressive humidity weighed on them. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and swarms of mosquitoes tormented them, spreading malaria. Some reported feeling watched, though they didn't yet know what lurked beneath the water. As exhaustion set in and morale crumbled, the first signs of madness took hold. Some soldiers hallucinated, seeing phantoms among the trees. Others collapsed from sheer fatigue, unable to move forward or go back. A few, realizing the hopelessness of their situation, attempted to take their own lives rather than endure what lay ahead. But it was too late. Unseen and unheard, the real killers of the swamp were already closing in. The first night in the Ramree Island swamps was unlike anything the Japanese soldiers had ever faced. Exhausted, disoriented, and weakened by hunger, they pushed forward into the dark, steaming jungle. Each step sank into thick, sucking mud, the air chokingly humid, thick with the scent of decay. At first, it was the insects that tormented them. Mosquitoes, ticks, and biting flies swarmed in relentless waves, stinging every inch of exposed flesh. Malaria was an inevitability, but this was the least of their concerns. The jungle, they soon realized, was a living entity, one that offered no sanctuary, only suffering. As the last traces of daylight faded, the jungle began to shift. Branches snapped in the distance. Strange ripples disturbed the blackened water. Low, guttural sounds echoed through the trees. The men, though trained for combat, felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping into their minds: fear. The jungle becomes a predator. As the soldiers pushed deeper, their tight formations disintegrated. Some tripped over roots, slipped into unseen pools, and lost their footing in the thick sludge. Others, too weak to carry on, simply collapsed into the swamp, never to rise again. The thick foliage blocked out the moonlight, turning the swamp into a suffocating void. Weapons were useless here. Their rifles, caked in mud and damp from the humidity, jammed as they struggled to reload. A few tried lighting torches, but the dense air and constant moisture made it nearly impossible to keep them burning. Then the first scream tore through the night. A soldier, just a few steps ahead of the others, was there one moment and gone the next. His body vanished beneath the surface with a violent splash, his rifle slipping from his grasp. There was no thrashing, no struggle, just the sound of something immense pulling him into the depths. Then, another scream. A second man disappeared. His cry cut short as an unseen force yanked him below the water. Panic erupted. Some fired blindly into the darkness. Others sprinted forward, desperate to escape an enemy they could not see. But the swamp was not a battlefield. It was a living death trap, indifferent to bullets, screams, or strategy. Realization sets in. The men began to understand the horror of their situation. The swamp was not just killing them with disease, starvation, and exhaustion. It was hunting them. Some soldiers climbed onto half-submerged logs, hoping to escape the unknown terror lurking beneath the water. But these makeshift rafts were not logs at all. A soldier cried out as the log beneath him began to move. Before he could react, it rolled violently, throwing him into the water. For a moment, there was silence. Then the surface exploded as something massive dragged him under. The water turned red. Now, chaos took over. Men scrambled up trees, desperate to escape the water. Others tried to wade through, hoping to reach solid ground. but each movement stirred the swamp, sending ripples that attracted the real hunters. Then came the growls, deep, guttural, unnatural. Yellow eyes appeared just above the waterline, unmoving, watching. The saltwater crocodiles, some over 20 feet long, had been waiting. They were patient. They were powerful. And now they were ready to strike. One soldier, delirious from exhaustion, fired his rifle wildly into the water. A splash, then silence. Then, without warning, something lunged from the depths, massive jaws snapping shut around his torso. He barely had time to scream before he was gone. The murky water churned as the crocodiles began their feast. Some victims were dragged under instantly, disappearing into the blackness. Others, still alive, were spun violently in the infamous death roll, their bones snapping like twigs as the crocodiles tore them apart. The jungle, once filled with the sounds of insects and distant gunfire, fell eerily silent, except for the occasional splash. Somewhere in the darkness, something was waiting. The darkness of the Ramree Island swamp was more than just the absence of light. It was a suffocating void filled with unseen horrors. The Japanese soldiers, now hopelessly trapped, clung to whatever dry land or tree roots they could find. Some remained chest deep in the water, too exhausted to move, their rifles now nothing more than dead weight. But the real terror had only just begun. For hours, the swamp had been eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from distant gunfire and the occasional panicked whisper among the soldiers. But below the surface, in the black, stagnant water, something was moving, watching, waiting. Then the low growl came. A sound so deep, so unnatural, it didn't seem to belong to any living creature. It vibrated through the water, a territorial warning, a death sentence. Eyes, dozens of them, began to break the surface. Yellow, unblinking, calculating. The crocodiles had waited patiently, letting exhaustion and sickness do most of the work. Now the hunt was about to begin. Without warning, a soldier vanished in an explosion of water. His scream was short-lived, replaced by the thrashing of something massive beneath the surface. A tail lashed out, sending another man flying. Panic took hold. Some soldiers fired into the water, but their bullets were useless against the thick, armored scales of the crocodiles. Others tried to run, but the mud pulled them back. The more they struggled, the more noise they made, and noise meant death. One soldier, barely keeping his head above water, suddenly felt something brush against his leg. He froze. His breathing became shallow. He dared not move. Then the pressure came. It was slow at first, almost gentle. Then, in an instant, his entire lower body was crushed as jaws the size of steel traps clamped down on him. He didn't even have time to scream before he was gone. The crocodiles were not just killing, they were feeding. Each victim was dragged under the surface, subjected to the infamous death roll, a brutal spinning maneuver designed to tear flesh from bone. Limbs snapped. Water turned red. Some soldiers were torn apart immediately. Others were drowned first, their bodies stored beneath submerged logs for later consumption. A few lucky ones managed to climb onto exposed roots, trembling as they watched their comrades disappear into the black abyss. Some tried to climb trees, but the dense mangrove canopy trapped the humidity, suffocating them even further. Now they weren't just facing the crocodiles, they were dying from the swamp itself. As the hours passed, it became clear this was no longer an escape. It was a slow, agonizing execution. Dehydration set in. Some men, delirious from thirst, drank the swamp water, only to vomit it back up, their bodies rejecting the filth. Others, too weak to carry on, simply laid in the mud, waiting for death. But the worst were those who lost their minds. Some soldiers, driven insane by exhaustion and fear, waded willingly into the water, whispering prayers as they surrendered themselves to the crocodiles. Others attacked their own comrades, fighting over dry ground. One man, his face hollow with madness, laughed as he walked into the water. He turned back, smiled, and whispered, "Better this than the waiting." A splash, then silence. The few who survived that first night would never be the same. By sunrise, hundreds of men were gone. The water was choked with shredded uniforms, broken rifles, and floating bodies. The crocodiles, having fed, slipped away beneath the surface, leaving only the silence of a jungle that had claimed yet another victory. The survivors, weak and broken, knew they could not endure another night. Some started whispering among themselves. A desperate plan began to form. There had to be a way out. But for those who remained, time was running out, because night would come again, and the crocodiles would return. By the time the sun rose over Ramree Island, the swamp had become a mass grave. The once organized Japanese forces were now nothing more than scattered, terrified survivors, a handful of men who had somehow evaded the jaws lurking beneath the water. For those who lived, the experience would haunt them forever. Among the chaos, a small number of soldiers managed to crawl out of the swamp, barely alive. Their bodies were emaciated, covered in festering wounds and insect bites, their minds shattered by what they had endured. One Japanese survivor, later captured by British forces, could barely speak. His words came in fragments, the water, eyes, screaming, gone, all gone. Another survivor, suffering from severe malaria and delirium, kept whispering, "They never let go. They never let go." Some British and Indian soldiers who had taken part in Operation Matador recalled seeing ghostly figures emerge from the swamp, stumbling and collapsing in the mud. These men, once fierce warriors, had been reduced to shadows of themselves. The British forces never pursued the Japanese into the swamp, knowing that the terrain itself was a greater enemy than any weapon they could wield. They simply surrounded the exits, cutting off any hope of escape. But what they heard during the nights was far worse than anything they could have imagined. British soldiers stationed near the swamp reported hearing blood-curdling screams that lasted for hours, followed by eerie silence. Then, the splashing of massive bodies moving through the water. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Rankin, one of the British officers in the operation, later stated, "The sounds were unlike anything we had heard in war. You could hear them, men crying out for their mothers, others praying, some just screaming until their voices were gone. And then, nothing." A British war correspondent documenting the campaign later described the battle as one of the most nightmarish encounters of World War II, not fought between armies, but between men and nature itself. The story of the Ramree Island Crocodile Massacre has become one of the most infamous in military history. But how much of it is true? The most widely cited claim, from British sources, suggests that only a few dozen Japanese soldiers survived out of the 1,000 plus who entered the swamp. However, some historians argue that disease, starvation, and exposure were the primary killers, not the crocodiles. The Guinness World Records lists the event as the greatest disaster suffered from crocodiles in history, but even they acknowledge that the exact death toll from crocodile attacks is uncertain. What we know for sure: saltwater crocodiles are apex predators capable of ambushing, drowning, and consuming humans. The Ramree mangrove swamp was an ideal hunting ground, full of deep pools, thick mud, and hidden channels, perfect for ambush predators. Japanese survivors and British soldiers both reported horrifying accounts of men being dragged under, and no known large groups of Japanese forces ever emerged from the swamp. Even if the exact number of victims remains disputed, what is clear is that the swamp itself was merciless. For those who survived, the war did not end on Ramree Island. Captured Japanese soldiers were haunted by the swamp for the rest of their lives, suffering from lifelong nightmares, PTSD, and hallucinations. Many refused to speak about it, unable to put the horror into words. For the British soldiers who witnessed the aftermath, the sounds of the night, the splashes, the cries, the silence, stayed with them forever. And for the world, Ramree Island remains a chilling reminder of what happens when war meets the wrath of nature. Because in that swamp, it was never just the enemy that was hunting. The Ramree Island Crocodile Massacre remains one of the most terrifying and debated stories from World War II. It has been described as the deadliest crocodile attack in history, where hundreds of Japanese soldiers were supposedly devoured in a single night. But how much of this is fact, and how much has been exaggerated over time? To separate truth from myth, we need to examine historical records, eyewitness accounts, and the known behavior of crocodiles. The Battle of Ramree Island was a real and documented military engagement. In early 1945, the British 26th Indian Division launched Operation Matador to seize the island from the Japanese 121st Infantry Regiment. The British, using superior firepower and amphibious tactics, forced approximately 1,000 Japanese soldiers to retreat into the mangrove swamps. British military reports confirm that very few Japanese soldiers emerged from the swamps alive. Most either perished due to disease, exhaustion, starvation, or animal attacks. Guinness World Records lists the event as the greatest disaster suffered from crocodiles in history, but does not specify exact numbers. Eyewitness accounts from British soldiers describe horrific screams, splashes, and eerie silence, a suggestion that something unnatural was happening in the swamp. However, no official document states the exact number of soldiers killed by crocodiles. This is where fact and speculation begin to blur. Military historians and wildlife experts disagree on whether the crocodile attacks were as extreme as the legend suggests. Saltwater crocodiles are apex predators and are known to attack humans. The swamp was an ideal hunting ground: murky waters, thick vegetation, and slow-moving, exhausted prey. Eyewitness reports from British soldiers and captured Japanese survivors describe men being dragged under, torn apart, and never resurfacing. The case against it: crocodiles rarely attack in large coordinated groups. They are solitary hunters, not pack predators. Most Japanese soldiers likely died from disease, thirst, and starvation before ever encountering crocodiles. No mass graves or large piles of human remains were ever found, making it hard to confirm a large-scale crocodile attack. The most likely reality: the truth probably lies somewhere in between. Many Japanese soldiers died from exhaustion, dehydration, and tropical diseases before reaching the deeper swamps. Crocodiles absolutely attacked some soldiers, especially those trapped in the mud or attempting to cross deep water. The psychological terror of the swamp, the sounds, the movements, the unseen threats may have intensified the fear and spread panic. While crocodiles did play a role in the deaths, the swamp itself was the true executioner, killing men through starvation, disease, and sheer hopelessness. The idea of an entire army being hunted by nature is one of the most haunting narratives in military history. The psychological horror of hearing men screaming in the dark, unable to fight back, knowing they were doomed, makes this story unforgettable. Over time, the death toll may have been exaggerated, and the role of crocodiles may have been amplified by the sheer fear they inspire. Additionally, wartime propaganda often exaggerated enemy losses, which could have contributed to the story's spread. The British military had a vested interest in making the Japanese defeat on Ramree Island seem even more catastrophic. But regardless of the exact numbers, one thing is certain: the Ramree Island swamp was a death trap. For those who entered, only a few ever returned. And to this day, no one knows exactly how many lives the swamp truly claimed. The Ramree Island Crocodile Massacre remains one of the most horrifying and mysterious events of World War II. Whether dozens or hundreds perished in the jaws of crocodiles, or whether the swamp itself was the true executioner, one fact is undeniable: this was one of the most harrowing examples of nature turning against man. The soldiers who entered the swamps were not just fighting an enemy army. They were fighting exhaustion, disease, starvation, and a ruthless ecosystem that offered no mercy. For many, it was a slow, agonizing death, far removed from the honor and discipline they had been trained for. The Battle of Ramree Island serves as a grim reminder of war's unpredictable horrors. It is often said that war is hell, but in this case, hell was the swamp itself. For the soldiers trapped in the mud, there were no battle lines, no strategy, no chance for victory, only survival. Unlike the horrors of war where men fight men, this was a battle against nature itself, an enemy that does not negotiate, does not tire, and does not fear. The same environment that provided strategic advantage to one army became a merciless graveyard for another. The British forces, who remained on dry land, had little reason to risk their own men in pursuit. They simply let the jungle do the killing for them. The psychological horror of Ramree Island is what makes this story unforgettable. Imagine being in complete darkness, surrounded by unseen killers, hearing your comrades disappear one by one. The sensation of hopelessness, isolation, and sheer terror is something few could ever comprehend. Perhaps that is why the story of the Ramree Island Massacre has lasted through history. It is not just a war story. It is a survival horror, a nightmarish encounter where war met the unrelenting force of the wild. Many soldiers were trained to fight in forests, jungles, and cities, but nothing had prepared them for a battlefield where their weapons were useless, where the enemy did not think, and where death came from beneath the water. To this day, no one knows the exact number of men who perished in the swamp. The official records state that only a handful of Japanese soldiers survived, but no detailed documentation exists to confirm how they died. What we do know is that very few men ever emerged alive. The jungle and its murky waters have kept their secrets, swallowing both the bodies and the full truth of what happened. Was this truly the deadliest crocodile attack in history? Or was it simply a tragic, slow demise caused by exhaustion, thirst, and sickness? The truth is likely a combination of both. The soldiers who fell into the swamp were already weak, lost, and desperate. Some were certainly taken by crocodiles, but many more may have simply collapsed, never to rise again. Over time, the story of the massacre may have been exaggerated, with the role of the crocodiles amplified by the sheer fear they inspire. It is also possible that wartime propaganda played a role, with the British military eager to emphasize the scale of the Japanese defeat. But regardless of the exact numbers, one fact remains. The Ramree Island swamp was a death trap. For those who entered, only a few ever returned. And to this day, the whispers of their final moments still haunt the waters of Ramree. Thank you for watching. This is Freak Files channel that bring dark history and horror story to life via documentary. And remember, war is cruel, but nature is merciless.